Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm your host, Jeff Freeman, and tonight we are going to be having a sit-down conversation with author James A McQuiston. James has written 10 books on the subject of Oak Island over the years, and he states that number 10 is his last. Now he's on a new endeavor, working on a podcast by the name of Oak Island Plus. You can find a link to this podcast down in the description below of this particular show tonight, or you can go to oakislandplus.com. Because we covered so much in our conversation this evening, I'm breaking this up into 3 parts, each about 25 minutes long. I hope you will enjoy Part 1 with James A McQuiston. Tonight, we have the author James A McQuiston, and James is the theorist for Oak Island and also the author of about 10 books on the subject. He also had the second place theory of those theories that are presented to Oak Island about who has been on the island over the course of the years. 10 books you've written on the subject, and how did you get started with this? I think you originally met the Laginas back in like 2016.
Yep, it was. What happened was I was watching the show, and I was actually enticed by all the big equipment, like the boys with their big toys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Watching it. Yep. But I realized one day I was working on my own family genealogy, and we're related to the premier knight of Nova Scotia right now.
Really?
As it is right now. And the family got that knightship back in 1625, and so it just struck me, well, hey, I wonder if they even know about the Knights of Nova Scotia. And so I sent them an email to that Oak Island Tours, and the next thing I know, they called me and talked for about an hour, and they asked a ton of questions. A lot of them I didn't know the answers to because it was kind of new to me too. But I started investigating, and we started trading emails. And after, I'd say, 6 months of it, they wrote and said, you need to write a book because all of this is just going to get lost in our emails, and you've done so much research. So that was my first book, Oak Island Missing Links. And then at that point, during that writing, I tripped onto my basic theory about William Alexander being responsible for the Oak Island mystery and his partner, Alexander Strachan.
Now, how did you find that portion? Where did that come about?
Well, actually, that's a very good question, because I had touched on the subject, but Cal Hancock, who was at the time, he may still be, but he was the grand historian of the Grand Lodges of Freemasonry in Nova Scotia. And he sent me an email and said, you should look up these 2 old books, because a lot of old books are scanned in by universities or by services. And so you can literally be reading a book from 1600s or 1700s on your computer. So I thanked him, and I started looking for that. And I found a different old book, and it had the first 3 Freemasons, who are William Alexander's son, William, his son, Anthony, and his partner, L. Strachan. And I thought, well, that's pretty odd that they're associated with Nova Scotia, and they're also associated with the Freemasons. So I got to look into this. Well, in that book, it had a treasure that L. Strachan stole. And I believe it was used to finance Nova Scotia, and possibly part of it was buried on Oak Island. His distant relative way down into the 1800s actually owned the Nolan Cross lots from 1841 to 57. So that puts a Strachan right on the island. But he wasn't the only one. A lot of Knights of Nova Scotia family members, they were the governors of Nova Scotia, of New Brunswick, of Prince Edward Island. They were in the Masonic Lodge in Halifax. So there were just so many connections. I couldn't believe it. Even Dalhousie University is connected. So I thought, well, I'm just organically investigating it, 1 book at a time. When I would get done with a book, I'd kind of think I was done. I used up everything that I found, but then there'd be some kind of dangling conversation or question or whatever. And lo and behold, I'd find something else, and it's like, oh my God, I got to go back to this. And for a number of my more recent books, I've said were going to be the last, and they weren't.
Yeah.
I've told you that before, and
Mm-hmm.
told other people. But at this point, I am done. Every book, except perhaps the first one, all the other books talk about the same theory, but they each talk about it from a different angle with different amount of proof. And I think that my books, well, I know they present information that you're not going to find anywhere else ever.
Right.
Unless you want to go down the road that I've gone down for the last 8 years, dangling conversation aspect to it, that you just get done with one and somebody sends you something, or you just accidentally trip over some new stuff.
New information, yeah.
In the last book, but you can't republish, And so, and then I guess to some extent, the third one is that in spite of the fact that I have hundreds of readers, and I guess you'd call them fans, it's hard to get the mainstreamers to accept it, or to even listen to it or read it, or, and I'm not just talking about Oak Island theorists or historians, although there is some reluctance there, but I'll just give you a couple quick examples. Doug and I were going to have a meeting with Dalhousie University, because we've
now when you say Doug, you mean Doug Kroll?
Yeah, Doug Kroll.
Mm-hmm.
We had
from Oak Island, yeah,
the archivist at Dalhousie, because we connected them in about 8 different ways, and so we'd been emailing back and forth. We had the date set up. So we planned on me going up, giving my presentation for the year, and 2 days later going to Dalhousie. Well, during my presentation, Doug announces that Dalhousie canceled. And I said, why? And he said, he wouldn't give me a reason. So I think we got too close to the, to the knowledge, whatever. And Doug told me that he has heard that there's a whole basement full of Oak Island artifacts at Dalhousie.
Oh, really?
And that's where the 90-foot stone was taken. The man who started it was the past Grand Master of the Scottish stonemasons. His father was, his son was, his nephew was, and all the way down to the current Grand Master is related to that same family. So they've not totally run it, but they've been a principal part of Scottish stonemasonry, or Freemasonry, I should say, right from the very beginning. And and then in another case, I prepared a breakdown of my beginnings of Freemasonry story for the Society of Antiquaries, where I've been a fellow since 2014. And when you submit a paper, it's supposed to be two of your peers review it. Well, there was so much to it, because their grammar and the way they spell words is different, as you probably know. And so I had to do it all British style and all that. And I had to follow all these procedures. So it took me weeks, and I submitted it, and they only showed it to one peer, and he rejected it outright, which was extremely disappointing. So finally, one last one is, I've proven pretty much that that area of Mahone Bay is what used to be called Merligash, which sounds like, oh, what, so what? But I'll tell you what, when we get into this. But I talked to the person who's supposed to be the main historian in Nova Scotia about maps and geography and all that. And we got into quite a back and forth on email, and I've got 4 maps that show it saying Merligash. But in spite of that, she resisted. And I'm like, well, how do you, if you can't accept that, how do you explain it then? Because I didn't invent these maps. They were, the 2 of them were from the 1600s, 2 of them were from the 1700s. Images, or perhaps the actual map, still exists. So how can you look at the map and say it can't be, So mainstreamers, and I know a lot of people already know this, but they may have positions to protect. They may not want to be looking like they're on the fringe of something. They've been taught that same story their whole career, and they just seem so reluctant to listen to And it isn't just that it's something new, it's actually something old. I'm actually finding the documents, the maps,
Right.
books, whatever, and saying, look at this. It says this right here. This isn't me saying, oh, I think the Templars dug a hole in the swamp to go to the money pit. I'm saying, look at this piece of paper. This is from the government of the British Isles in 16 whatever, you know, and this is what, that kind of thing. So I thought if I did this, we're going to do it once a month. My co-researcher, Doc Hamels, he's a Freemason. He's got a PhD, and he's quite enthusiastic about Oak Island. And we're just going to take one subject and just delve into it deeply. It's not going to be your show or whatever. You know, it's going to be like, for instance, our next one is going to be stone structures like stone walls, wells, and roads. And we'll talk about them on Oak Island, them.
That's going to say, that's going to be an important factor right there because of what they've recently found on Oak Island.
Yes. And
interesting.
But so we'll be taking a subject and trying to go for about an hour, maybe half hour to an hour on it, and try to get some experts, which we actually have a couple experts for this next show. So it's going to be something that you can watch anytime you want, but it will come out hopefully the middle of each month. And it's called Oak Island Plus because we thought, well, we'll almost certainly drift off Oak Island at some point. So we need them to say that. And so it's on Facebook at Oak Island Plus, and it's on the web at oakislandplus.com. And either of those places, you can click on our introductory episode, which is only 30 minutes or so.
I actually watched that. Now, is this going to be on YouTube as well?
It's going to basically be on YouTube, but you're
you can access it different ways.
Yeah, those two ways.
Okay. And we'll have the link down below, folks. We have the link in the description of the show here for that. So you could just click on the link. It'll take you right over to their Facebook group page. Then you can find the link to the YouTube channel from there as well. Might actually include that.
So I was up there in 2017. Actually, I was the last person to present in the old war room right after they tore everything down, moved it to the new one. They didn't use that one. I was up there in 2018 and they did use that one. And a second meeting because this gentleman brought in a really rare knighthood medallion that was found up at New Ross, but there was no Prometheus crew because it was a Saturday morning. It was all last minute, and Doug and Rick and I worked so hard to get this gentleman to trust us to bring it there. But we do have photos of it. And my third book, Oak Island Nights, tells the story about it.
Right. Yep. I remember that one.
But while I was up there, Rick had me meet with this Captain Robert McKinnon, who dove on a shipwreck within sight of Oak Island. And it had some items on it that tie in with my story. So that wasn't in my Oak Island Nights book, so I had to put it somewhere because it was tough. So I wrote Oak Island Endgame. And that was the year of COVID. So I wrote that in the spring. I wrote that novel for something to do because where could you go in 20, you know? And then I realized when I was writing Oak Island Endgame, I realized that quite a few people from the Plymouth colony had moved on to Oak Island or were searchers there, their families. And I thought, what's that all about? And it happened to be the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. So I wrote Oak Island and the Mayflower. And anyway, it went on. I wrote Oak Island and New Ross, connecting those two places. And that book was really cool because Tim and Alessander helped me. They own the foundation up there.
Right.
Steve Guptill helped by doing some surveying between the Nolan's Cross and that foundation. And Carmen Legg, of all people, because he used to be the historian for New Ross. He quite a bit. And then I had a place over in England that owned a painting of William Alexander getting his charter renewed from King Charles.
Really?
That's only the second image of him that exists anywhere. The one that's always been around was a black and white etching in a book, and everybody's that, and they've adjusted it and redrawn it and all that. But this painting, I read about it in a book from the 1800s. I asked the curator of this. It's a mammoth house and estate. And he said, well, let me look into it. And he gets back to me and he said, well, it's actually in a collector's vault. But I'm going to get it out and we're going to take a high-res photograph of it.
Wow, that'd be great.
Right. So part of that was the cover of my Ross book. Then I don't even remember exactly where. Oh, again, I thought it was done. And I tripped over this Mary Queen of Scots cipher that has every single symbol on the 90-foot stone in her cipher, and except for the 3-dot triangle for the master mason. That wasn't in her code, but it is on the 90-foot stone. So even if her code wasn't used, somebody still has to explain why there were 3 Masonic symbols on that stone. And I kind of have a theory that why the stone went missing. I think the Freemasons took it because they knew the story behind it. And, people collect everything. I mean, some guy just recently had to return like $70 million worth of illicit collectibles that he got from around the world, and people just do that, And so paintings get stolen from museums and they never hear about them again,
Right. Well, that's something I thought about the 90-foot stone is that, if it existed, and again, there's a lot of talk about it and stories about it, but we don't have any actual proof that it existed.
Right.
So if anybody had that nowadays, you would think that they would be talking about bringing it forward. They found that one stone up in the Halifax in the book down in the basement of the book bindery. And they found that stone and it turned, and they were trying to say, well, this was the right size and basically shape and color and all that. But I think that if somebody actually had the stone, if it did exist, they're going to take better care of it than something like that, I would think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And
so I think somebody still has it somewhere. They're just keeping it hidden.
And the one mention, the first mention of it was in 1862, Macaulay's article in the newspaper. And he mentioned finding it and that it had symbols on it that people couldn't understand and all that.
Right.
But then it was mentioned again in 64 in a newspaper article, and that article said it's still there to be viewed by the public. And that's when John Smith had it in his fireplace. And I've heard or read somewhere along the way that he actually had a tea house in his house because he had so many people coming to visit to see that stone. Now the newspaper paper that it's still there now to visit, so you wouldn't think they would do that if it wasn't, because they get called on it right away.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
And the very next year that it was taken off the island, according to the story, the very next year it was taken off the island, taken to a Dalhousie professor who he did the 40 feet below.
Yes. Yeah, the translation. Yep.
And he passed it on to Reverend Kempton in 1909, I believe. And he sat on it for many years till that, I believe it was Edward Snow, the author. He showed it to him and then he put it in the book. And that's when the general public saw it for the first time. So it has a chain of custody, sort of. But in my Curses and Codes book, Oak Island Curses, Codes, and Secrets, I try to present everything I can find about the stone to show that it seems like it was real. And if it was, this is what happened. So anyway, after that book, I got approached by a Masonic lodge that's a research lodge. And they wanted me, they set it up a whole year ahead of time to do a talk with 50 Masonic historians.
I remember you telling me about that. Yeah.
I thought, well, none of my books, what they wanted to know was what I felt was the link between the Templars and the Freemasons. And I wrote Island Knights Templar and Freemasonry, but I still hadn't found this little piece of information that I'm going to tell you about today. And so they were going to buy 50 books for the 50 people that were going to be there. And I thought, you know what? They're going way out of their way for me. They're going to put me up in a hotel for a couple nights. I'm going to whatever. I better go out of my way for them and make sure that the book that I hand them is what they really want to see. So my friend John, or Doc, he's a doctor of education, so everybody calls him Doc for the fun of it. And so we were trading all this information, and we were really going down rabbit holes like crazy. And so we realized that we had to stop with the rabbit holes and start with analyzing it. So we got this room at a restaurant, and like a banquet room. They had big room dividers that you could pin stuff on. Took a whole bunch of sticky notes with us, and we wrote down all these things that we'd been getting from our emails and memory, whatever, and we started pinning it up. Pretty soon we had an XY axis. We had 12 guys across the top, and I'm talking about 16 foot long at least.
Wow.
Across the top, and about a dozen events or people or places down the side, and we were patching in all the empty holes. And that we spent all day doing that. Then we came back the next day, and he started plugging it into an Excel file, which itself is about 2 foot wide, it looks like it. And we were plugging it in. We were still finding, well, why isn't this there? Or was that guy one of them, or whatever, like, was he a Privy Council member? And so we were doing more research on the fly. So after 2 days, we came away with a tremendously better understanding and a lot of information. So then I started writing the book and using what we did those 2 days, what we did in emails, what I had researched on my own, whatever. And we came up with this Oak Island, a Masonic conspiracy.
I see,
and when I first told the Grand Master at the Research Lodge the name of the book, he said, I'm not sure that my people are going to like the word conspiracy being associated with Freemasonry. And
so true. They get enough of that already, I think.
Yeah. So I mentioned it to my Freemason friend, and he says, the problem is they don't have the advantage I do. They don't know what the content of the book is. If they did, they'd welcome that title. So I put him back, and I told the guy that. He said, yeah, you know what? I talked to a few other guys, and we're okay with it. Go ahead. So
there you go.
So that's the book. So so we have some slides if you want to.
Yes. Okay, yeah. So I'll bring up this one. This is the first of the pictures that you wanted to show here.
Well, the reason why I included this is because this was created by a group called the North British Society, who was the public face of the Halifax Freemasons. They were the same members. They met in the same hall and all that. And they brought these stones over from Alexander's castle in Scotland. And that castle sat on former Templar land. And so my point with it is that I'm not by far the only person that thinks William Alexander had some significant role here. In fact, originally I got the idea from Mark Finnan reading his books. I love his books. I have all three of them. And I actually emailed with him a little bit. But other authors like Court Lindahl and Steve Sora and even R.V. Harris kind of touched on it a little bit. And the Alexander family themselves talk about being up at New Ross. The tradition is that they were up there from 1623 with a break for a few years, but they were back again until 1654. And it tied in with Joan Harris, who did the little booklet on New Ross.
Right.
And she had got her information from 3 Mi'kmaq. Well, one of those was John Noss, who she dedicated her book to. And I actually got to email with him. And he told me, yes, I'm the John Noss that the book's dedicated to. I was with her the whole time when we were uncovering the foundation and all that. And he said, I said, well, why did you know all this? And he said, well, my grandfather picked me out of all the kids and said, you are going to be the person to pass on the oral tradition of tribe. And he said he took 3 years to teach it all to me and make me memorize it all. So that's how I knew. And so I was so honored to even talk to this. He's like a legend because he's in her book and all that. So anyway, the point is that I'm by far not the only person to pick William Alexander. I'm actually riding on a number of coattails there. But even the Freemasons of Halifax knew he had some kind of role, at least in settling that area. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put it there. They wouldn't have put it an hour from Oak Island in Halifax if he didn't have anything to do with it there.
All right.
So then the next photo, which is the Edinburgh Castle, that's a spot in Edinburgh Castle when all these gentlemen were becoming knights of Nova Scotia. They couldn't all travel there to accept their land, and there was a procedure that they would do back then to possess your land, where you would go to your land and you would drop soil on it. You'd pick up soil and rocks and you would drop them, and that was called sassin, which meant you were taking possession of that land.
Oh, okay.
In order to follow through on that tradition, King Charles designated part of Edinburgh Castle as a part of Nova Scotia. So they literally would go to Edinburgh Castle, stand on that spot, drop their dirt on the ground there, and take possession of their land. And it's still there. The sign's still there today. So again, that shows the significance of the Knights of Nova Scotia in Scotland. They have their own little chunk of Edinburgh Castle.
Well, I hope you have enjoyed part 1. Please look for part 2, where we go into some ancient maps that reveal more clues about the origins of Oak Island, Nova Scotia.